So good evening, everybody. For the majority of you who won't know you, in fact, I think it's only Professor Walker and his missus that know me in the audience. My name is John Iredale, and I lead the medical school here, and I'm Vice Principal for Health Services. And it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all. And I'd particularly like to welcome the high school students who are here as part of the Widening Pathways scheme. So you're all very welcome, and I think we're in for a real treat this evening. So I don't intend to say very much at all other than just to introduce you to Professor Walker. Clearly he's going to talk about obesity. So obesity, why is it important? I mean, I'm delighted to say, looking around this room, I don't think it's important to any of you, which is in dramatic contrast to the clinic I've just left, where most of the patients that now come see me, I'm a liver doctor, have liver complications of their obesity, in effect. They're usually diabetic, but it's a real problem. Why is it important for us in Scotland? Well, I'm ashamed to tell you that public health doctors measure the obesity of individuals at particular stages of their lives, and certainly 2 years ago, Scottish 18-year-old females were bidding to top the league of obesity, vying with America and Mexico. So there we are, instantaneously. It's not just a current problem here, it's a current problem worldwide. And developing economies are fairly rapidly discovering the propensity of their populations as they become more affluent to become more obese. So important problem and an important global problem. Almost most importantly then, why Brian? Why Professor Walker? Brian is a refugee. He was born in Glasgow and succeeded in making the 50 miles across to Edinburgh unscathed. He works in endocrinology and metabolism and has really made the field of steroid metabolism his own. He is an acknowledged world expert. I've had to sit through 10 minutes of Brian telling me where he was off giving talks in the last 2 weeks, and it includes places like Paris and Zermatt. So I don't want anyone feeling sorry for him that he's got to be in Edinburgh this evening. But he really has made this field his own. He is a fantastic speaker. We're in for a real treat this evening. It's going to be enlightening and highly educational. And Brian, I'd like to invite you to come and give the Our Changing World lecture.
Right. Well, thanks very much, John, for the introduction. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Welcome to this evening's session. We're going to discuss obesity, and I guess that's why perhaps there's a good turnout tonight, because I think we're all interested in obesity. It's something that we all tend to engage with. We recognize it on the street. My experience is that everybody has an opinion about what the origins of obesity are, and everybody has an experience of their own management of body weight. So we all have an opinion about it, and that's a good thing. And I suppose the background to that is because for as long as humans have existed, we've been obliged to have a relationship with food and with eating and with nutrition. We have to eat to be nourished and in order to reproduce. And I suppose it's also in our collective culture and thinking that we're used to the threat of not being adequately nourished. So, it's not that long ago that we've seen major famines and disasters, Ethiopia in the 1980s, the Irish potato famine the century before. These are still relatively recent events and cause major world crises. And against that background, for most of the time that humans have existed, it's actually been considered quite a good thing to be obese. It's been a sign of affluence and success, if you like. It's only relatively recently that we've got into this kind of culture where actually skinny is good and obese might not be so good. So we now have this enthusiasm for success being represented in thinness, and for a whole industry around encouraging people to be thin. And the flip side of that is that people who are obese now suffer to some extent from being stigmatized. And I think a lot of the things that people think about when they think about obesity are quite negative. And they include thoughts like, well, actually it's people's own fault, it's self-inflicted, if only they had some willpower this would be an easily fixable problem. Others would like to transfer the problem to, for example, the political establishment and ask what's the government going to do to solve this problem. And others would say that the medical profession has been inadequate in its response, particularly not producing adequate treatments which would solve this problem, or the treatments that they do produce are really slightly ridiculously expensive and not appropriate to apply across the population. So You may have your own little bubbles of thoughts that you brought this evening as to your views about obesity and where we should be going with it. But what I'd like to do is to really try to unpick the obesity story. And in a few different ways. We can't cover everything tonight, but I would like to just address the underlying biology of obesity, to get us all thinking about energy metabolism, about why people get fat, and therefore to think perhaps in a slightly different way about the people who are obese in our communities and how we might tackle that in future. And along the way, I'll tell you a little bit, only a little bit, about the research that's going on in Edinburgh in this field. So let's start by talking about who gets obese in the population and how much of a challenge that is. So we've been measuring obesity for some time using the simplest measures, and body mass index, BMI, which many of you will have heard of, is probably the simplest measure of all. It takes your weight in kilograms and divides it by your height in meters squared to give a number. And the World Health Organization has decided that the magic number for obesity is 30. A tangential word is to say be wary of any cutoffs. They don't really mean anything. We're describing here a continuum of risks of obesity. But nonetheless, if we use this arbitrary figure, it's helpful in dividing people. So I'm going to show you what proportion of the population has become obese to a variable extent with a BMI greater than 30. Although that's, in some senses, only the tip of the iceberg, because below that is another large group of people who are overweight, and then a group who might have what we would term an ideal weight. So, BMI greater than 30. Now, I'm going to show you data for the US because it's very well documented and also because it creates a really very good visual picture of what's going on. And these are data collected by the CDC, which is a public health network in the US. And this goes back 30 years now to 1985. And it shows the rates of obesity, that's the prevalence of or the proportion of the population that has a BMI over 30. And you can see that for many states that was dark blue, between 10 and 15%. But for many states also, there were no data, white states. And that tells you something very important, that 30 years ago, nobody paid any attention to obesity at all. It certainly wasn't regarded as a medical problem, was scarcely regarded as a public health issue. So everything I'm going to say about obesity is actually recent history. Now, if I spool through the subsequent years and show you the prevalence of obesity as the years go by, and we get into the 1990s, the data becomes more available, and we start to see some dark blue states, and they have prevalences between 15 and 20%. And as we get into the mid to late 90s, when I started to get interested in this field, you get prevalences of about above 20%, above 1 in 5, particularly down here in the southern states, for reasons we'll come back to perhaps. And then 98, 99, gosh, it's really spreading, isn't it? Like wildfire, 2000. We've now only got Colorado surviving. Colorado's an interesting state because it's mountainous, the mile-high city of Denver. It's probably that altitude that in some extent protects them from obesity. People move there who are active and outdoorsy. So they're a slightly different group of people. So watch Colorado for a minute, because meanwhile Mississippi is getting fatter and fatter. It's now above 1 in 4 obese. Colorado, sadly, has no longer got its status as being light blue. 2004, 5, oh gosh, we're seeing states now with greater than 1/3 obesity rates. And as we go right through to 2010, which is the last time that it was counted in this way, you've now got a whole swathe of the states with more than 1/3 of the population obese. Now, that's really dramatic, isn't it? It's really compelling. It's almost shocking to see how that's happened over just one generation. And it matters, and it's happening everywhere. So here are the rates of obesity going up in the USA, and this is England following them. And you can see that effectively the slope is the same. The UK is just a few years behind, if you like. And many other countries are following too. There are 1 or 2 exceptions. Japan is an exception for reasons we could discuss later. And I'm sorry if you were feeling pleased that England was up there and Scotland wasn't. Well, here's the UK groups broken down, and Scotland actually is top of the pops as far as obesity goes. And as John was saying, obesity in Scottish youth is actually remarkably high, and that is the harbinger for future obesity in adults. And it's a worldwide problem. So here are the maps again with percentages showing the average BMI actually now, the average in different parts of the world, many very dark areas indicating high BMI. And the other thing to say is you might look at somewhere like India and say, well, that's all right. They've got quite a light color. They've got quite a low average BMI, which is true. But there they have this thing called the double burden of malnutrition. So on the one, their population is much more widely spread than ours in terms of body mass index. And on the one hand, they have an undernourished group who have malnutrition of the type I showed you a picture of earlier. But on the other hand, they also have the double burden, an additional group with significant overnutrition and obesity. So, does it matter that everybody's getting more obese? You know, in the past, we thought it was a good thing to be obese. It was a sign of affluence and success. So shouldn't it still be the case? Well, of course, we've learned that it really does matter, and it matters for lots of different medical reasons. So people with obesity in general have increased risks, and I'm not going to labor this point because I think most people are familiar with it. And they include risks of, in blue here, for example, mechanical factors like varicose veins, arthritis, hugely responsible for low back pain and also for hip and knee joint replacements. It includes things that are hormone dependent, like some hormone dependent cancers. Next to smoking, we believe that obesity is the next most common cause of cancer in the UK. And other hormone dependent problems like infertility, and which of course is a source of great misery for many. And then in the red, I've put the cardiovascular risk factors and cardiovascular disease, such as high blood pressure, abnormal lipid profile, increased risk of heart attack and stroke, and crucially, this one, type 2 diabetes, which follows from obesity. And what you see if you look at the maps for type 2 diabetes along the bottom and the maps for obesity on the top is that they mirror each other. These are the most recent data, 2013. It's a slightly different measurement scale. You can see the whole of the States has now gone dark red. And in mirroring that is that the States also has prevalences of type 2 diabetes which can be as high as 10%. So it matters. And it matters in terms of economic and personal cost as well. This is an estimate from Public Health England of the costs to the UK economy. I won't go into the detail of where all these come from, but you'll note things like social care for obese individuals being a substantial budget. The cost of the NHS, which is including the costs of that increase in diabetes, which of course is a major component of NHS activity. The costs of obesity medicines measured, these are not proportional, these coins, this is millions, this you'll note is billions of pounds. So that's the background. Now I want to turn to what is happening that is causing this explosion in obesity. And some of you will think that's really obvious. And in a way it is, because body fat, which is what we're describing here, we're describing an increase in body fat. Body fat is simply a store for energy. So what happens is you take fatty acids, as they're called, you pin them onto a glycerol molecule, and those are called triglycerides, and you store them away in fat to be released for energy later. And 1 kilogram of fat contains about 7,000 calories or so, which is about the equivalent of eating 3 days of food on an average diet. And energy, of course, is a finite entity. So what goes in must come out to remain in balance. So your energy balance and the amount you store in fat is dependent upon the balance between what you eat and how effectively it's absorbed and what you burn. And you burn it either as a basal metabolic rate, that's what essentially keeps you alive, keeps you ticking over if you do nothing else. You burn it in thermogenesis, that's generating heat because we're warm-blooded animals. And you burn it in the activity that you undertake, the exercise that you undertake. So you would think that the change, this explosion in obesity, could easily be accounted for by changes in energy balance, either with food in or energy out, and particularly with exercise out. And we increasingly think about that in terms of what we call the obesogenic environment, the idea that things have changed in our environment in the last generation that have led to an imbalance in that balance. And the question is really, where does that occur? Is it the food or is it the exercise? Now you'll be surprised that it's actually been quite difficult to generate definitive data to prove it one way or the other. These are probably the closest we've come to understanding changes in food intake, although they don't actually prove what people ate. They tend to prove what they bought or what they were provided with, which is where the thing breaks down somewhat. But what it shows is between the 1960s and the end of the last millennium, the food availability in industrial countries steadily rose. It rose even more sharply in what they called then the developing, now we call the low to middle income countries, or countries in transition very often. And that rose even more steeply. So that across the world, food provision increased. We often hear that along with this increase in food intake, there was a reduced exercise level, and there's much concern about closing school playgrounds and our kids not going out and walking to school and lots of car journeys and all that stuff. Interestingly, it's been difficult to prove that the obesity pandemic has been accompanied by changes in energy expenditure through exercise. Difficult to prove. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it's difficult to prove. This, for example, is a study by a colleague in Aberdeen, John Speakman, who is an expert in a particular technique called the doubly labeled water technique, which allows you to measure energy expenditure, energy balance. It allows you actually to quantify how much energy expenditure is attributable to activity. And if you do that, and you compare across 1990 through to 2005, in many hundreds of individuals in both the US and in Europe, funnily enough, you don't find a change in physical activity, a decline in physical activity. And if you look at data that are produced from, for example, for the proportion of adults undertaking the recommended 30 minutes exercise 5 times a week, those proportions haven't changed very much in the last decade or 15 years, while obesity has continued to increase. So I think the message here is that it's probably, and this is a probable, it's probably largely about food intake and slightly less than we think about exercise. So if it's about food intake, I think most of you would be able to guess, the sorts of changes that have taken place. We're aware of fast food being energy dense and being very dense in fat content, which is a higher energy value than other types of food. There's different eating patterns as well, which may exacerbate the problem. So people tend not to eat in defined episodes of eating. They tend to snack all day and skip meals, strangely. Then there's the availability of, for example, soft drinks and lattes at the coffee store and all those other things. And I like this figure that over 20 years, the US consumption of sugar-containing soft drinks rose an astonishing amount from 27 gallons per person per year to 44 over 20 years. That's a big change, isn't it? And there's a huge range of products in supermarkets, and portion sizes have increased, and the size of cookies that you buy in Starbucks is much larger than it was 10 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. We're only now beginning to see some of those things being restrained. I mean, it's an innovation in the last few years, for example, that you'll see calorie counts on the front of the Starbucks counter, and you actually are beginning to see cookies shrink again, but it's a relatively recent change. So that's perhaps the understanding of what's happened to us in the last 30 years. But I titled this lecture Winners and Losers, and I did that deliberately because I now want to talk about whether this applies to everybody. It would be easy to think that, if we say there's a risk of being a smoker, that everybody who smokes is going to get lung cancer. If we say that there's a risk of obesity, that everybody with obesity is going to get diabetes, is that true? And also, even more broadly, if we take all of the people in this room and expose them to an obesogenic environment, is everybody going to become obese? And if we start to pick away at that biology and that susceptibility, we might start to learn more about why some people do become obese and others don't. That will become interesting, and it might allow us to start thinking about new treatments as well. And you probably all know people who appear to be more or less susceptible to obesity. You know the people who they're usually young men. In my experience, they often live in Pollock Halls, and they eat phenomenal amounts of food at the counter and never seem to put any weight on. And then, of course, there are other people, and these are the people that we often see in the clinic. John referred to them in the introduction, who really, do not feel that they can account for their level of obesity on the basis of what they eat. So is this real? Is there a basis to this? Well, I think there is good evidence and emerging and more strong evidence now that people do vary in their susceptibility. For example, some ethnicities make you susceptible to obesity. There are parts of the world like the Nauru, a Pacific island, where something in excess of 70% of the population is already obese with a BMI greater than 30. That happened after an episode of mineral wealth and a dramatic westernization of diet. But in response to that obesogenic environment, these people became phenomenally obese. Whereas in the US, there's some evidence that things are beginning to plateau off, that actually not everybody is susceptible because there's a significant proportion of the population who will not get obese in the current environment. I think the key thing, though, the key observation is that there are now genes, genetic variants between individuals which we have proven will influence susceptibility to obesity, and that really nails it, that there is differences in susceptibility. So let me now talk about the biology of energy balance, and we can think about how those differences might operate. So I told you that a kilogram of fat stores 3 days of eating. What that means is if you do some back-of-the-envelope arithmetic, if you ate an extra 50 calories a day, that's maybe just about an apple, and you did that for a year, you'd be 2.5 kilograms heavier at the end of the year. Or if I change it and say that over 30 years, over your adult life roughly, since I was a student, say, that if I made a 3.6% error in my food intake, I'd be 15 kilograms heavier than I was as a student. And I'm not. But do I monitor my food intake to the nearest 3.6% each day? Well, no, I don't. So then the question is, do we really control ourselves so strictly, or is there some intrinsic control of body weight? Here's another way of putting it. So in the 1960s and earlier than that, there were a number of metabolism investigators who had the privilege of being able to recruit students into their labs and lock those students up in little boxes called metabolic chambers and measure their energy balance and consumption, manipulate them over months and pay these students handsomely, and then they left happy after some months of being fed and looked after. And the sorts of experiments they would do in those days, I should say this is impossible now. For example, the last place in the UK that I was aware of that could do this was the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, and they're just moving out of that campus, so it's not going to happen anymore. Nor could they persuade any Aberdonians to spend months living in their metabolic cages either. But the sorts of experiments they did in the 1960s were to take people and overfeed them for a few months, and then to put them on an underfeeding diet, and then to return them to normal. And if I asked most of the people in this lecture theatre, or most men on the street, I'd probably get this story, that for as long as you overfeed somebody, they'll get fatter and fatter. And for as long as you put them on a diet, they'll get thinner and thinner. And indeed, when many of you choose, if you do, to go on a diet, you'll expect that for as long as you restrict your calorie intake, you'll continue to lose weight. And then at the end of the diet, if you go back to what you were doing before, well, that was a steady weight, so you would stay at the weight that you've lost. But that isn't what happens. What happens is this, that body weight plateaus off. So if you overfeed, you will reach a new plateau. And if you underfeed, and everybody who's ever been on a diet will have experienced this, you lose some weight and then you plateau off, and you have to do something extra to then lose some more and plateau off again. And so it goes. And when you return to the normal diet at the end, you inevitably return to the weight you were at before you started, if you don't return to something that's different from before. Now, what that's telling you is that as a result of overfeeding and increasing your energy intake, you must be increasing your expenditure to reach a new balance. And similarly, as a result of undernutrition, you must decrease your energy expenditure to reach a new balance and plateau. So how does that happen? Because that's a bit of physiology that might be really important to determining how susceptible people are to how obese they are. Where do they sit? Where does this plateau develop? Well, it happens, first of all, it happens for a simply mechanical reason. As you gain weight, you've got to carry it around. So you're going to expend more energy by carrying it around. But that's not accounted for entirely by that. Over and above that, there are a whole set of physiological mechanisms which probably humans have relied upon for as long as we've been around to protect us in an environment where we get undernourished. And now in an environment where we're overnourished, they behave slightly differently, but that's really what they're there for. And they live, these mechanisms, in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So just to orientate you, this is a slice of the brain through that way. This is your nose out here, or this person's nose, tongue, eyeballs on either side of that line. And here in the middle is the pituitary gland dangling on a stalk from this little triangular structure called the hypothalamus, much more important than you would think from looking into that picture. And what the hypothalamus is able to do is to send signals which control your energy expenditure. By the by, it also controls your reproductive function, so it links how well nourished you are with how likely you are to reproduce and have babies. In other words, you wouldn't want to bring babies into an undernourished or famine environment, so it tends to switch off reproduction under undernutrition. And the hypothalamus adjusts a whole series of signals, many of which are hormonal, some of which are through the autonomic nervous system, that's your noradrenaline-mediated signals, and also adrenaline through the adrenal glands, to modify the activity of energy-expending tissues like muscle, and indeed it modifies adipose tissue too. And the hypothalamus is also connected to a part of the brain, the cortex, or your thinking part of the brain, which mediates satiety and switches off hunger. The default position is hunger, by the way. You need an active suppressive satiety signal to switch it off. Unfortunately, most of us ignore whether we're hungry or not. Very few of us could claim to be genuinely hungry in the last week, say, or for many of us, the last month. And what we tend to do is to eat from habit, etc., and that overrides any satiety signal. Now, the next interesting biological question is, if that's what the hypothalamus does, how does it know how well nourished you are? Sitting in the middle of the brain there, where those two lines meet, what's the signal? How would it sense it? And the answer is that that's a whole biology which has been revealed to us in the last 20 years of research, since 1994 actually. Before that we knew nothing about this. And in 1994 we discovered a hormone which comes from the adipose tissue called leptin, which tells the hypothalamus how fat you are. If you're, and I'm going to tell you this deliberately about thinness first, if you're undernourished, your leptin levels fall. And that activates the hypothalamus to try to make you eat more, to switch things off, become more conservative, to reduce your energy expenditure, and to switch off reproduction because you don't want to bring a child into a famine environment. So that's probably the evolutionary purpose of leptin, is to protect you at times of famine. But in obesity, what happens is that leptin rises and rises as your adipose tissue increases. And its function is really to make things active, to induce reproduction, to switch on neuroendocrine activation and metabolism, and get you active and burning and make hay while the sun shines, really. And then there's a host of hormones that come from the gut, many more than are listed here actually, that influence satiety and make you recognize that you've just eaten. But my favorite is ghrelin, which comes from the stomach. If you've not had your dinner yet tonight, as most of you will not, you might be feeling a little peckish. I'll try not to go on too long. And if you're feeling a little peckish, that's because since you last ate, when you ate, it suppressed your ghrelin, and since then, as your stomach is emptied, your ghrelin levels have gradually risen to make you feel a little bit peckish again. It's a good hormone. Now, I can prove to you that the hypothalamus is important in regulating your energy balance and reaching that plateau if you were overfed. Because here are patients with damage to the hypothalamus. This patient has got this same tumor as this poor soul who died, but this live patient has got a craniopharyngioma destroying their hypothalamus. And the result is, if I plot that patient's body weight for you over a few years, you can see that over the years she's gone from about a healthy sort of 70 kilograms up to 125 kilograms, and I can tell you that I haven't plotted it, but it goes on and on over the years. It doesn't plateau off. It doesn't do what happened to those youngsters in the nutritional units. And that's because there's no adjustment. Despite carrying around all the extra weight, there's no increase, no adjustment in metabolic activity to compensate for the increase in intake, and there's no satiety signal to suppress hunger, so this person keeps eating and eating despite becoming more obese. The next key thing that's happened in the last few years is that we've then identified genes where a variation in those genes modifies this biology and tells us that individuals vary according to how these mechanisms operate, that one person is not identical to another in the way these mechanisms operate. The first bit that we learned was from a friend and colleague of mine, Sadaf Faruqi at Cambridge, who, working with Steve O'Reilly in really a world-famous environment, what they did over the last 20 years was to collect patients with very severe obesity, children with very severe obesity early in life. They have about 5,500 of these people, and amongst them they found a whole host of children who carry single mutations in particular genes that are the cause of their obesity. And it turns out that all those genes, they're the genes, this diagram doesn't matter to you, but all those genes that with asterisks on are the ones that they found mutations in different patients. And the interesting thing about it is, well, one of them is leptin, which comes from the adipose tissue. I told you about that. The other one is the receptor for leptin. The interesting thing about it is they all live in the hypothalamus, with actually one exception so far. So what that's telling you is that in these single gene disorders, it's all about the brain's sensitivity and signaling and its ability then to control your energy expenditure and appetite. Now, what about on a population basis? What do we know about the genetics for the whole population? And that is a field that's been transformed in the last 10 years, since 2006, by a technique called genomewide association. I'll tell you briefly what that is. So once we had discovered, by the Human Genome Project, we discovered the typical sequence for human DNA, we could then look at variations called polymorphisms, where individual nucleotides switch their sequence and change. So they're called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And with the technology advances over recent years, we've been able to measure individual SNPs on a chip and produce these sorts of images which tell you for any individual what your SNPs are. And you can measure 750,000 of those SNPs on a chip. And then you can plot your individual SNPs across all of your chromosomes, and you can plot the p-value, the probability of an association with any outcome variable, in this case, obesity. And these very high clusters of SNPs indicate genes that are responsible. Variations are responsible for the variation in body mass index in this population. There are now about 97 of those genes. The latest study just published covers 340,000 people, so this is pretty powerful statistics. It's identified 97 of these genes, and it's shown that variations in these genes are closely linked with variations in susceptibility to diabetes and to body shape and to blood pressure and cardiovascular disease and lipids and so on. And it's shown something else really interesting, which is if you take all those genes and then you plug them into modern, what are called bioinformatic databases, and you work out what the likely function of those genes are, and you work out whether they function, for example, in the heart or in the adipose tissue or in the brain, you get this kind of graph. So essentially, most of those 97 loci actually map onto pathways which are involved in the nervous system in the brain. They don't map onto other peripheral tissues. So again, rather like Sadaf Faruqi's findings about single gene disorders, what the population genetics is telling us is that variations in functions of genes in the brain determine how fat people are, over and above the obesogenic environment. So I think it's fair to say that obesity happens when you get an imbalance of energy intake against expenditure, which, crucially, this is crucial, which exceeds the individual's capacity to defend their body weight. And we all have a capacity, but it varies. What about susceptibility to complications? So this is all about how fat people are, but that might not matter very much if they didn't get any disease as a consequence of being overweight or being obese. And there's variation too in how susceptible people are. So there are winners and losers in how susceptible people are to the complications of obesity too. I was struggling to find examples of this. It's kind of obvious, it's plain as the nose on your face in some ways that there are people who are relatively healthy obese and others who are crippled by complications. But here are some examples. So these are two studies which took people who are at very high risk of developing diabetes. They're at very high risk because they start with a relatively high blood sugar level and they are overweight or obese. And in Finland or in the US, they then followed these people here for 8 years, I think here for 4 years, and counted those who developed diabetes. Sorry, on this side it's falling as you get diabetes, on this side it rises as you get diabetes, but essentially the message is the same, that actually only a proportion, less than 1/3 of each of these populations, actually in this case it's a half by 8 years, but anyway, not everybody within these populations develop diabetes. And they won't in future. You know, there will be a proportion of these people who never will develop diabetes. So it's not a universal risk. It doesn't just mean if you're obese, you will get diabetes. And then we've started to think about what determines that variation in susceptibility. And the sorts of things that we've been able to identify are things like body shape. So on the left is a typical bloke with what's called android, because he's a bloke, or central, because it's around his middle, or visceral, because if you actually do a cross-sectional picture, there's a CT scan, all the fat is inside, around his viscera, those are the organs inside. It's not under his skin. Or apple-shaped, I've never really known why. People say this looks like an apple. Anyway, that is high risk for diabetes and for cardiovascular disease, for metabolic complications. This person, on the other hand, in whom you can see the lean figure inside the subcutaneous adipose tissue that's surrounding her like a kind of suit, and she has very little visceral adipose tissue. All her fat is under the skin, in the love handles. And that person with what's called gynoid, because it's often in ladies, pear-shaped because of this pear-shaped distribution, a high hip circumference but a small waist circumference, that is low risk. So there's something intrinsically different about where you put your fat, what your risks are. And what we've learned about the adipose tissue is it probably, where you put your fat is, or the depots where you put your fat, be they in your belly or under your skin or in your marrow or wherever they may be, they behave very differently. And they're capable of exquisite physiological control. So they do all sorts of things, fat cells. They release fatty acids that can, I mentioned them earlier, they can signal to other tissues. They metabolize steroids. John said I was interested in steroid metabolism, and that's exactly what we work on, is the enzymes which metabolize steroids in fat. And therefore, they release steroids from the fat, and it's probably true that some of the hormone-dependent cancers in obesity arise as a result of release of steroids from the adipose tissue. And then there's been a host of a whole family of new hormones discovered from adipose tissue. There's something like 100 of them in the literature now, although probably only a handful of them really matter in humans. And they signal, I mentioned leptin, but there are other hormones too that signal from the fat to other organs and might influence whether you get diabetes or not. And they differ between the visceral fat inside your belly and the peripheral fat. And actually, the visceral fat inside your belly gets to release its hormones directly to the liver, which is an additional hit of why that might be adverse in terms of diabetes risk. And then there's genetic susceptibility over and above all that for diabetes. And this is the diagram consortium, 30,000 people with type 2 diabetes compared with control people who don't have it. And what these various findings implicate is actually peripheral tissues, not the brain. So variations in susceptibility to obesity probably lie in your pancreas and how well you can produce insulin, and in your adipose tissue, in the fat cells themselves, and how well they modulate your metabolic response to obesity. So I hope that's given you a sense that there's more to this than meets the eye if you think about susceptibility in individuals. Now let's be a bit pragmatic about it and say, well, what are we going to do about it? And how does that biological information influence what we're going to do? So it's easy to think that prevention is better than cure. That's always true. And it's easy to say, well, what we should be doing is preventing obesity and reversing the obesogenic environment. And the trouble is, that is hard. And we end up preaching to people, and people don't respond very well to that. And it's been true over a whole host of different public health measures over the years. And so for that reason, perhaps, there is no country in the world right now that can claim genuinely to have reversed its epidemic of obesity. There are some that have flattened it off quite well. And that's different from previous experience. So for example, Finland once was the world-leading country for cardiovascular disease, and they set about reducing cholesterol intake in food and abnormal fats in food, and they managed to reduce, over a generation, reduce their cardiovascular risk dramatically. Countries haven't achieved that for obesity. I'm not going to say more about public health measures. We don't have time tonight to go into it at any length. It's not my expertise. It's clearly a very important topic. What are we going to do to prevent obesity? But I want to talk instead about how we might respond to the people who are obese, who are suffering complications, and how could we develop treatments for them. So this is the current paradigm of how we operate in many health systems. We work through a sort of pyramid, and we grade our intervention according to how severe the obesity is and whether the person has complications from their obesity. So this is the body mass index up the left if you've not got complications, and these are the cutoffs up the right if you have got complications. And we move from giving them some general advice to then perhaps involving a dietitian to supervise dietary intervention, to then maybe giving them some drugs, about which I'll say more, and even considering surgical interventions. There have been many drugs for obesity over the years, and there's been enormous enthusiasm, as you can imagine, from the pharmaceutical industry to make drugs for obesity, because there's lots of people with obesity and they would need to take this treatment lifelong for it to work. So that's a big market and commercially very important. Some of those drugs have acted on food intake as appetite suppressants. Sadly, the simple fact is that all of those drugs which act on the brain have had adverse effects, which have led to them being withdrawn from the market serially, actually, and most recently rimonabant and then sibutramine went off the list. The only drug that we currently have licensed in the UK for obesity treatment is a drug called orlistat that works by preventing the absorption of fats in the gut. We don't have anything really that targets this end of the equation yet. And then we have surgery, and I won't go through the replumbing interventions that are used in surgery for obesity, but this is called bariatric surgery. It's designed to lose weight. Now, this is what drugs achieve. This is a 4-year follow-up comparing just normal lifestyle intervention with a sugar pill. I shouldn't call it, it won't be a sugar pill, you know what I mean, a placebo. Compared with orlistat, the only active treatment we have available. And there's about a 4% weight loss, which to an individual who, for example, weighs 100 kilograms at the start and you get them down to 96, doesn't feel like a great gain, even though as a population reducing by that percentage might be helpful across the board. Surgery is much more impressive, isn't it? Look, you can lose 40% your body fat and keep it off over 10 years with surgery. So surgery works. We just don't know yet why that's so effective. So the big emphasis has been on perhaps trying to do better with drug interventions which might ultimately mimic this effect. And here's an example, and it's a cautionary tale really. Rimonabant had an enormous investment from Sanofi Aventis. They produced a drug which was reduced body weight by about 6 or 7%. That's good. They showed that it prevented diabetes and improved lipid profile. And then they thought, right, the killer experiment here, the thing we really want to do is to show that it prevents cardiovascular disease. So they got it on the market, and then they set about the crescendo study to show that by having all those benefits, you would reduce events of cardiovascular disease. And about a year into the study, they'd recruited 18,000 people into this study. And their committee started looking at toxicity from the drug. And you know, the effect of rimonabant wasn't too bad on gastrointestinal upset, which is a common effect of any drug. But then they started looking at psychiatric effects. Now I need to tell you that rimonabant works by blocking the cannabinoid receptor, the receptor for cannabis. And you may know, that if you take cannabis, you get the munchies. It makes you hungry. And therefore blocking that receptor stops you getting the munchies and stops you being hungry. And that's why it loses weight. But you also know that if you take cannabis, you may know, that you get happy and giggly. And so if you block the cannabinoid receptor, you might expect not to be so happy. And sure enough, what they started to see were psychiatric side effects. And when they had counted their 5th suicide in this study, and they had said that 4 of them were in the rimonabant treated group and only 1 was in the placebo, they decided on the basis of those 3 individuals who had committed suicide out of 18,000, remember that these are a group of people who are obese, who have all the psychological consequences of obesity, in whom the rates of depression and suicide are actually higher than the general population. Nonetheless, that killed this drug. It was withdrawn from the market initially in the US, then across the whole of the world. And it put a great big black rain cloud over pharmaceutical development of obesity medicines, where many companies just withdrew because they said it's just too difficult to do this. Because in this case, the regulator, the government bodies responsible for monitoring trials and licensing drugs, they said that they wanted the drug withdrawn. But in many cases, it might have been the population. And the thing is, here's a quote from Paracelsus. Sorry, it's obscured by this, and I don't know how to get rid of that. But here's a quote from Paracelsus, a Swiss scientist and philosopher of the 1500s. And he said something very appealing. He said, "Poison is in everything. And nothing is without poison. It's the dose that makes it either a poison or a remedy. Every drug has a side effect. We can't have drugs for anything that don't have side effects, because if they're going to be active, they're going to have other effects." So this is all about perceptions of risk for treatments for obesity, and it's a very interesting story. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I want to turn to what we're doing in Edinburgh. I'm going to only give you a very sort of hand-waving overview of what we're about in Edinburgh in our obesity research. Most of it's based in one of our centres. So in our College of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine, we divide ourselves into multidisciplinary research centres where we have a combination of clinicians like me and biomedical scientists and physicists and engineers and all sorts of people actually working together on particular problems. And in our centre, which is funded in large part by the British Heart Foundation as well as others, we focus on cardiovascular risk and resolution. So we're interested in things all the way through from early life events which predict cardiovascular disease, through the risk factors of obesity, diabetes and hypertension, high blood pressure, through to the development of furring of your arteries and clotting off of your vessels, and through to recovering tissues using stem cell treatments. But the bits of this that might interest this audience talking about obesity are down at this end of what we're about. So for example, with colleagues in our neighbouring MRC centre, we have funding from the Tommy's campaign, which is a baby-focused campaign for a Centre for Maternal and Fetal Health, and there our colleagues have set up a clinic which specifically cares for people who are obese mothers during pregnancy. And in that we've embedded a lot of research, and we've shown actually that clinic will reduce, for example, the incidence of stillbirth in that group. And we've set up clinical trials within that clinical environment, and we're studying the outcomes of babies from those mothers and understanding their metabolism. Then members of our centre are involved with some of these big genetic studies. In fact, our neighbours in the Population Health Sciences group have contributed to many of those big GWAS studies. That I forgot to tell you, that was called a Manhattan plot, that when those p-values were peaking. And a lot of that work actually comes from here, and to what are called pharmacoepidemiological studies. So we have unique resources in Scotland to link drug treatments with measurement of outcomes according to our population database records of health. And so we're starting to do that and understand some of the drugs that predispose people to obesity because they influence the biology of obesity. And then we've got a big group of people working on a big problem, which is how fat works. So in Edinburgh, we've not been so interested in the appetite and the brain, where colleagues in Cambridge, for example, are very expert in that. We've really concentrated on the peripheral fat tissue and trying to understand what determines variations in susceptibility to diabetes. So I told you that susceptibility to obesity lies in the brain, and susceptibility to diabetes and its complications largely lies in the peripheral tissues and the fat. So for example, we are studying how different fat depots, visceral, subcutaneous, marrow, etc., how they develop. What are the switches that determine whether they're on or off? How are they affected by inflammation and low oxygen activity in the tissue? How do we control our mitochondria, those little energy factories inside the cells? How do we switch tissue into what's called brown adipose tissue? That's heat-generating adipose tissue. And could we encourage switching tissue into that form to burn off calories and make people thinner? And we're interested in steroid action. And for all of these, we're trying to develop new approaches to drug development, not because that's the only solution to obesity, but because it has to be part of the picture. So I'll tell you one very brief story. I'm interested in a hormone called cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It's released from the adrenal glands under the control of the hypothalamus and pituitary. So the hypothalamus, in response to variations in nutrition, regulates the release of cortisol, and it has lots of effects. So here are the signals that control it. It changes the time of day with stress, with inflammation, but also with variations in nutrition. And as a result of changes in cortisol, you see changes, adaptations, for example, in how much energy you store in fat. So it induces some of these energy expenditure changes that I described earlier. And that's great in the short term. During stress, these are good adaptations. But if that elevated cortisol is maintained in the long term, that becomes maladaptive. And some of these adjustments become damaging. So we see patients with very high cortisol levels because they've got, for example, tumors releasing cortisol. And they look like this. Here's a patient with what's called Cushing's syndrome. And the defining feature of Cushing's is the development of obesity. It's visceral obesity. It's apple-shaped obesity. And so too, patients with Cushing's have increased cardiovascular risk. They have diabetes much more rapidly than other patients. They develop cardiovascular disease. They also lose their memory, which is a different story. Now, the key thing about Cushing's is it's reversible. If I take away this patient's tumor, causing her high cortisol levels, a year later, that's what she looks like. So what we're trying to do in our research group is to find ways of manipulating cortisol to try to mimic that benefit. We've demonstrated that cortisol may be overactive in people with obesity, and now we're trying to intervene. And if we're going to intervene, we don't want to hit this part of the system because we can't interfere with the stress response safely. But by developing new drugs and opening up the black box of the factors which determine how different tissues respond to cortisol, we might have new treatments. And that's what we've done. We discovered inside that black box, we discovered an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD1, and it increases cortisol within the fat tissue, independently of the blood levels. Fascinatingly, it's regulated by your nutrition, by what you eat. Not just how much you eat, but what you eat. It changes differentially according to fat or to glucose sugar load. And it responds to inflammation and so on. It's increased in obesity, so it's generating more of this signal in people with obesity, making them as though they've got a kind of Cushing's syndrome within the adipose tissue. And it predicts how susceptible people are to their obesity. It predicts, that enzyme level predicts whether they'll go on and get diabetes. So that could be a target for drugs, and inhibiting that enzyme could be good, and that's what we've developed. And in fact, within the university, we've developed a compound called UE2343, which we've put into humans. We've taken it all the way through the drug development pathway. It inhibits the enzyme. I can't tell you yet what it does for people with obesity because under this black rain cloud, it's quite difficult to raise money for studies for obesity drugs these days. But luckily, because I told you that Cushing's causes your memory to be impaired, it turns out that inhibiting this enzyme also improves memory. This is the headline we attracted a few years ago, but more significantly, we've now gone into a partnership with an Australian biotech company who have raised the funds to further this project through drug development, and we'll take it into patients, and if it's successful, we'll be able to test its effects in obesity. So that's some of what we do in Edinburgh, and then finally, let's go back to where we started this lecture. I told you about the biology of obesity, I've told you about how we think about it and what research we're doing. let's re-examine some of the prejudices that I hear people say about obesity. And I think when you think about it being self-inflicted and it just needs willpower, then spare a thought for an understanding of the biology of obesity, and that actually there is genuinely a difference in susceptibility. And we can prove that through genetic variances, but there probably, over and above that, there'll be many other influences. And you know, telling people that is enormously powerful. When people come to the clinic and you explain to them that yes, you may have a different susceptibility, it isn't your fault necessarily, that enables them then to take some control over things and to recognize that that might actually be perfectly reasonable then to still try to eat less, because you still do. What's the government going to do about it? We haven't really talked about this much this evening, but it is a big issue. And clearly we need to keep trying to find ways in which we can nudge the population as a whole to try to reverse this pandemic. And the routes to that will be multifactorial. And they might include exercise, but they certainly need to include managing our food and its availability and engaging with the food industry and all those things you've heard elsewhere. And finally, when it comes to medics and what we can do in and around obesity, well, I think some of the lessons in here are that it's much more complicated than it first appears. One of the mistakes that we all believe we've made in medical research over some decades is to sort of apply panaceas to certain areas. Oh, if you have obesity, you will need this tablet and it will work. Well, that just isn't true. What we actually experience in the clinic is that different people respond to different interventions. So the challenge is for us to predict who's at risk, who is susceptible to the complications, find out what contributes to their risk, and then individualize their treatment. That's a very trendy thing. We used to talk about stratified medicine, personalized medicine, individualized medicine. Obama lately called it I've forgotten what he called it. That's a good sign. What did he call it? Precision medicine. He called it precision medicine, which is the idea of targeting it to individuals. It's all the same thing. But crucially, if we're going to advance treatments for people with obesity and reduce their complications, frankly, we're going to need an environment where we accept that there is risk. And from the rimonabant experience, I'd suggest that we're not very good at that at the moment. So with that, I'd like to thank the many funders of our research. This is the absolutely crucial underpinning, the funders providing the resources and the people and the talented people who come into research to contribute their ideas, and that's enormously important. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I shall shut up. Thanks very much.
Is there any value in considering different kinds of appetite, not to do with hunger, which I can understand Grail and Leptin do da. I've never met an obese person whose problem was eating when they were hungry.
Yes.
And
yes.
I work in addictions myself, and so I see different kinds of overconsumption.
Yes. So there is a great enthusiasm for saying that, well, we've learned from the genetics of obesity susceptibility that it all lives in the brain, and therefore that's where the pharmacology should live. And you might know that there are still ongoing trials of various peptide hormones from the gut being injected into people, which make them feel nauseated, and that stops them eating, but it's not actually a pleasant way to be treated. And like you, I would be skeptical because we don't think most of us are responding to hunger. This is not a primordial mechanism necessarily. I would share your skepticism that just addressing that satiety mechanism will get to the bottom of this. Having said that, I think there is still room for maneuver, and whether it's by understanding better the hedonic response and its addictive reinforcement, or whatever it is that is the key to that might be worth dissecting. And what we don't know is amongst all those 97 genes, lots of them might be involved in exactly those sorts of circuits and not in the circuits that I've described to you. So yes, I think your point's well made. There are lots of different styles.
Very briefly, I probably won't go on. Is it possible that what's inherited is the location of these HSD enzymes causing different kinds of overappetite or addictions? Or
yes.
That's what I'm wondering about is that what's inherited?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly reasonable speculation. There are parts of the brain where 11-beta-HSD1 is expressed. If you took that as just one example, so here we are taking one molecule out of the blue or arbitrarily and saying, is that important? Well, yes, it's expressed in certain parts of the brain. It's modified with age. We haven't yet really tested whether it's modified by obesity. It is in peripheral tissues. We don't know about the brain very much in obesity. So could variations between individuals underpin differences in, for example, their preference for high-fat food versus high-sugar food, or their preference for eating at night versus their diurnal rhythms. Yes, of course, that's a perfectly reasonable speculation.
Hi, there's been things in the news about, fecal transplants possibly interfering with people's, obesity mechanisms, and
yes.
people, basically, I just want to get your thoughts on
yes.
immunological processes, inflammatory cascades possibly being part of the obesogenic.
Yes. Now, this is very dangerous territory for me because I'm standing beside a former head of the Centre for Inflammation Research, and so
it's your gig. I'm out of it.
So I better not say too much about inflammation. Now, but what you're describing is really important. So there's this discovery of the microbiome, which is effectively the combination of your good and bad bacteria in your gut. And the idea that actually people who are obese have developed an adverse microbiome, and that's contributing to susceptibility. I probably should have had that somewhere on a slide, actually. That's a really, really neat idea. And then if you could take one person's microbiome and transplant it into another person, people have done this, and for those of you who don't know, this is done by fecal transplantation. So you take one person's feces and you, to a certain extent, filter it, but not dramatically so, and then you put it back into another person. And that has been shown to have effects, certainly in animal models. What I'm not clear about is how effective it is in humans. So again, we could put layer upon layer of the variables that might influence much of this biology. And for example, if I took the 97 genetic signals, I can only account for less than 3% of the variation in obesity using those genetic signals. So there's much, much more besides that, and the microbiome would be one story. Probably there'd be people in the room who'd come up with other stories.
Are there research groups in Edinburgh looking into it at all?
The microbiome, not so much. There is expertise in what you have to be able to do is to sequence all the bugs, the genome of those bugs, in order to characterize the distribution of the microbiome. And that is available in Edinburgh. There's a particular interest in the evolution of infectious diseases in Edinburgh based at King's Buildings. That's a very strong group. It hasn't yet been applied so much to microbiome research, although in the agricultural setting in the Roslin Institute and the vet school, that is actually where they're probably heading in terms of those investigations.
Hi.
Yeah,
you mentioned about the risk of getting disease is related to the fat distribution. So I wonder what are the determining factors of fat distribution?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, well, the major one is gender. And sex hormones are highly influential in determining whether, like me, with a certain amount of testosterone left, but dwindling in my middle age, I get essentially a visceral obesity, the apple shape. Whereas in the presence of lots of estrogen, you would tend to develop your peripheral fat and get wider hips and put your energy storage there. So that's the major determinant. Over and above that, there are other hormones. So I mentioned that Cushing's syndrome causes this central apple-shaped obesity even in women. So it allows the peripheral tissues to actually shrink the adipose tissue. And then there are probably genetic factors. There are, I didn't emphasize it, but I flashed past some evidence that genetic variables influence body fat distribution as well as they do how much fat you have, and there are ethnic variables, so you'll be aware of, for example, the typical different shapes of some ethnic groups. One thinks of South African Xhosa populations who typically have enormous buttocks, for example, on which children are rested, and that's the way that they carry children around. It's very different patterns of fat distribution are intrinsically determined.
I was wondering, what do you think are the causes for the pandemic of obesity? It's here, thank you. Because from the graph that you saw that you showed in the US or in general in the world, it's really unlikely that the genetic pool of the population has changed so much over the past 30 years. And if you think that targeting these causes would be more effective than targeting the outcome that is obesity itself.
This is a pretty sharp audience because that's a really important point. So it is often said that the explosion in obesity has occurred so quickly over one generation that it can't be genetic. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that what can be genetic is your susceptibility to that rapidly changing obesogenic environment. So there's no doubt that the explosion that's occurred in the last 30 years has to have an environmental drive. And we know what's changed. We know food intake's changed. We know the environment has changed. We know affluence has changed and so on. The point I'm making about winners and losers, the title of the talk, is that within that there is heterogeneity. Within that there are individuals who are going to be susceptible to be obese and others who are not. Within that, the obese group, there'll be individuals who are susceptible to complications. It's about dissecting out that susceptibility that we'll learn how to intervene and indeed actually understand the fundamental basis of why some people respond to an obesogenic diet differently. Does that help?
Yeah, my question was actually quite similar, but I can kind of follow on from that. And I think I was wondering, you said that actually by telling patients that there was a sort of genetic cause in some respect, that it gave them a little bit more ownership over it. Do you not think that it could actually have the opposite and gives them a bit of an excuse as to the fact that it's predetermined and they actually aren't influencing it at all?
Well, you use the word could, and I suppose it's conceivable, but it hasn't been my experience. And I actually don't think, it's difficult to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who experiences severe obesity and who has tried every diet under the sun and comes forward to a medic and hopes that they can help and has repeatedly been told, this is your fault, stop eating so much, you fool, this is all your problem. And I didn't say actually that I would explain that it's a genetically caused condition. I didn't say that. I said what I'd explained to them is there is an underlying biology. There is an underlying variance in susceptibility. And to just acknowledge that gets away from the blame game that most of these people have experienced over many years. And so it's just a simple observation that people appreciate that kind of discussion more than they do finger pointing.
Is there data to quantify how levels of stress have been changing in the population over past decades? Could that be contributing to increases in obesity?
Yes, there are data, but they're from relatively small samples. And the challenge with stress is to define it. People mean different things, and you need to be quite clear what kind of stress you're talking about. Now, the stressors that have been identified, for example, in a beautiful study called the Whitehall study, based in London, in Whitehall, in the civil service, undertaken by Sir Michael Marmot and colleagues, really transformed this field over in about the 1970s and 80s, because before that we used to think that the people who were going to get overweight and diabetes and cardiovascular disease were the high-powered businessmen at the top of the tree or the mandarins in the civil service. And what the Whitehall study showed was it was quite the opposite, that it's the people at the bottom of the tree who are more predisposed, as I think now we would take for granted, predisposed to cardiovascular risk and diabetes, and indeed very, very clearly predisposed to obesity. The only group in the UK that's not getting fatter are well-to-do women at the moment, and everybody else is, and the less advantage you are, the more fatter you're getting. And what the Whitehall study showed was that the people at the bottom of the tree are suffering particular measurable stresses, mainly to do with locus of control, that sense that they can't reach their aspiration, whereas the businessman or the mandarin at the top is doing exactly that. They're doing what they wanted to do, you know, and they have control. So that sense of loss of locus of control has been associated with the risk. And then if you start to unpick the mechanisms, you might say to me, is that associated with a high cortisol level, the stress steroid hormone? Well, we did that study, and sadly, we couldn't prove that. So we don't actually know. It's probably more associated with the sympathetic nervous system activity than it is with the cortisol activity.
Good. One here, then, please.
You have quite clearly shown that it's a large factor involved in obesity is the increased availability of food. But you've not specified exactly what the differences are in these foods. For example, the difference between complex and simple carbohydrates, the difference between glucose and fructose, and the individual responses to the constituents of the foods that they eat.
Yes. Well, I granted have glossed over that tonight. That's not because it's not interesting or indeed that we don't think about it. Had we had until maybe midnight tonight, we could perhaps have covered this ground. So for example, if I take one example of, your question really is, well, what would be the consequences of changing the macronutrient constituents of a diet? We can deal with micronutrients separately, but talk about macronutrients first of all. The balance between carbs and protein and fat and the choice of high glycemic index versus low. So if we take our cortisol system, we've explored exactly how that's regulated by, for example, studying people on low-fat or high-fat diets as they lose weight and monitoring what happens to the changes in the peripheral 11-beta-HSD1 and the central control of the cortisol. Or we've infused people with sugar, or we've infused them with lipids. So a lot of this has been explored. You can imagine those are complicated studies to do, and you can imagine that it would be impossible to generate the sort of numbers of observations with which you could then go and do genetic susceptibility and link those genetic variations, which each has a tiny effect, with variations in, shall we say, response to a high glycemic index diet as well. So that's the gap that you're hinting at here, which is that we have a lot of physiological and functional information about diets and macronutrient constituents. But it's actually very difficult to link those up with his population-based genetics to sort of tie these two ends of the story together. That's maybe why I end up glossing over that end.
Great. We had a question in the middle. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I just got a question about going back to drug targets. So you mentioned about targeting these specific enzymes. Now the body has obviously have a lot of different negative and positive feedback mechanisms, especially when we're talking about something like the cortisol regulation. So if you say, for example, down-regulate a certain enzyme, other parts of the brain may up-regulate other parts of the brain, which has been shown in previous drugs. Is there much sort of research or...
And so, what you're saying is that for every effective, efficacious action, you're going to have a reaction, which may or may not help your efficacy. It might actually offset it. And that's effectively what I'm saying about the risk-benefit, having to accept risks from treatment. The answer to your question is really that if you start out on a blank piece of paper to design a drug intervention, you could imagine some of the consequences. But what you don't know is whether they will be sufficient to completely compensate for the effect of the drug, or whether they'll help or hinder. So you actually have to then go and do some experiments. So there's a danger of sort of thinking yourself out of doing any interventions. One of the joys that I've had of being involved in drug development, which is not actually from the university's perspective, isn't a great producer of lots of high-impact papers or big news stories. It's a rather slower process. But the joy of it is that the rigor with which people, in my experience in the pharmaceutical industry, or who've got a background in drug development training, the rigor with which they ask questions about those compensatory effects of every intervention and seek to identify ways of studying them is exquisite, actually, and really very high quality. So I think it's our challenge in a way is for the pharmaceutical industry and for ourselves to convey that we do think very hard about those sorts of adaptations and try to measure them and try to adjust for them. But at the end of the day, we need to find out by experiments what works and what doesn't work. And I think the population as a whole is willing to accept the risk, for example, of undertaking experiments in people. People are very willing to do that, certainly in this part of the world. And I think the population as a whole is probably more willing to accept risk than the regulators, who are fearful that they'll be the one who signed off the drug that caused unexpected side effect X or Y.
So given that the obesity is largely genetically susceptible, would you say that it is nature's response in dealing with the human overpopulation? And would our efforts to eliminate obesity be an interference to the idea of survival of the fittest?
Yep. Well, I didn't say it was, don't exaggerate the genetic effect. I said there is a genetic effect. It isn't largely, it accounts for a percentage of the variance, which is less than 3% in what we can measure so far, though there's probably lots more that we can still seek to measure. But you're quite right. There's a very respectable hypothesis, which called the thrifty genotype hypothesis, which says that we've evolved to have defensive mechanisms against famine. Of course we have. At a famine, anybody whose physiological systems were not well set up to cope with famine would die from starvation, and those who survive would carry forward genes that were protective against starvation. And there's therefore a very respectable part of the thinking that says that the members of our society now who become the most obese in the obesogenic environment of today actually historically have been the most advantaged individuals in protecting themselves from famine. So we've we've turned the whole thing, we've flipped the coin and started looking at obesity as a sort of disadvantage rather than an advantage. I'm not sure that beyond that, though, it doesn't help very much, because of course one of the things that the human race has now done is to remove itself to a certain extent from Darwinian evolution. I'm not going to go into the politics of whether that's a good or bad thing, but that's just the way it is. So I suspect that we are where we are with the genetic mix of the population. And so we're not, it informs variability, but it doesn't give opportunity, if you see what I mean.
Is obesity totally and utterly a modern thing, or is it known to have existed in, say, Viking times? Has anybody studied groups from a way back in time to establish whether it existed then?
Yeah, I feel ill-informed on that, probably, but I don't know that literature well. I think what I would say is it's a bit like, people living to the age of 100, it's said that there were always members of society who lived to the age of 100, it's just now there's many, many more of them. And that's probably true, that there have always been people who are extremely obese. I think there are, you can see in some ancient art, for example, in fact I flashed up a picture that was a Byzantine sculpture. You can see in ancient art examples of people portrayed as being very obese. So clearly there were individuals who were very obese. And some of the enthusiasts for single gene disorders think that perhaps some of those people had some of those single gene disorders that my colleagues in Cambridge are now unraveling. So I think it's almost certainly the case that there was always a heavy part of the population, yes. And historically they were affluent. If you were starved, you were not going to be like that.
Can I ask you a question about unhealthy weight in children? You inferred that it was difficult to judge which individuals would go on and develop complications. So I'm expecting that possibly the answer is that we don't know. But is there any relationship to the timing of the onset of the unhealthy weight, whether it's pre or post-puberty, its trajectory, how quickly the weight is gained, and how long the person has had an unhealthy weight?
Yes. So there is a host of epidemiological work which describes associations of certain patterns. And it's certainly true that obesity tracks with age. By tracking, what I mean is that if you are at the top of the distribution for your age group, whatever your age is, you will tend to stay at the top of the distribution as you get older. And as you get older, everybody gets fatter. We all get fatter as a group as we get older. One of the reasons for the expansion of obesity is that the whole population's got older. And that was adjusted in later figures on those graphs. But if you imagine tracking as a phenomenon, the higher you start, the higher you will end. And therefore, if you start as an overweight child, the earlier you start being overweight, the higher you'll be on relative to your peers, because children are generally thinner. And so you're likely to stay at that high track. And so that does predict disadvantage. As to changes in slope, speed of weight gain and so on, I'm not so sure about that actually. I'm not sure what the literature shows on that. But the result of all this is that we're now seeing, for example, in our practice in diabetes, which I don't practice in anymore, but I used to, we used to say that people with type 2 diabetes would invariably be over 40 years of old. And that's when we would see type 2 diabetes. And actually, when I was a young doctor, that was generally true. And now you're probably aware there are a host of teenagers. There's a whole clinic for people with type 2 diabetes in teenage. That whole thing has shifted so far forward. And if you look at the lifestyle of the individuals affected, almost invariably you can put your finger on things that they do that are really radically obesogenic and may have a very high glycemic index food, as we were talking about a minute ago, and other reasons why they've caused that very acute injury. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure the earlier the worse. It has to be true, but I can't quote you chapter and verse on the evidence.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for talking tonight. I really enjoyed the speech. I just have a quick question about fetal programming and whether the contribution and the influence you think it has actually on the present obesity endemic. And do you think it will be more of an issue in the coming generations?
Yeah, that's another good question. So the phenomenon, for those of you who don't know, the phenomenon of fetal programming has its origins with a guy called David Barker and others, who showed that if you just took simple measurements of babies at birth, like birth weight, you could predict whether they would have cardiovascular disease and a whole variety of other diseases as well, but cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, etc., later in life. Actually, in that range of things, obesity didn't really figure in the early studies as an outcome measure. But it led to a whole series of experiments that we've been involved with over the years and descriptive studies in populations, trying to understand what it was that was making people born small subsequently get cardiovascular disease. And there's this idea that there is programming of systems, that there's some sort of imprinting of physiology and biology at the start that is permanently affects your susceptibility in later life. And that has a biological rationale, that it might mean that if in any given society you're going through generations of being well-fed and then underfed and varying, that you might collectively and across decades of time, a generation, you might be able to adjust your physiology to be more appropriate to the environment you find yourself in as a group, and then adjust it back again if things become more meager and you get smaller babies or bigger babies or whatever. So that whole biology has emerged. What I don't think it's done yet is to inform very clearly susceptibility to obesity per se. It's actually rather more about diabetes and cardiovascular risk. What we know is that if amongst our obese mothers who deliver, the children who are delivered of obese mothers tend to be obese, but of course they generally live in the same household and may share the same obesogenic environment and habits of response to it, and they share many of the same genetics. So it's difficult to determine if that's early life programming. We know that the children of obese mothers get cardiovascular disease, but we're not sure if that's mediated by any obesity. So it's a slightly murky field how much that applies to obesity.
Given the risk-benefit story in pharmacology and the producing a medicine for example, overexpression of your HSD enzymes, is it possible that for most people in the population, the best use of all that knowledge is going to be a non-pharmacological approach?
Yeah, so when I was putting the slides together for this evening, I realized that there was a risk that this would be seen as medicalizing the problem. Because I put a lot of slides together and I thought, well, I'm going to speak for 2 hours, they won't like that, so I'll throw some out. So I threw a lot out. And I left in the ones that speak to what our research is involved, and we all pick an area to work in and what we do. So I apologize if I've given the impression that I think that pharmaceuticals is the solution, because it isn't for the population the solution. It is an important part of the response. And it's a part that I happen to be involved with and active in. So there's sort of what I infer from your question is that maybe you're just challenging that philosophically, and where should the resources best be deployed? And I think you will note on my final slide I said the government should keep investing in public health, nudging, and I think that's extremely important too. So I didn't mean to be biased, but the thing about this is mega teams working across large ranges of activity, and you're listening to one person who lives in a certain part of this domain, right?
Well, I think the range and the searching attributes of the questions, Brian, speak to what a superb job you did educating us all on the challenge that diabetes faces us with and in highlighting some of the solutions. So would you all join me once again in thanking Brian for a truly superb evening?